All right, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to those of you in the East Coast, and welcome to today's webinar on securing the human perimeter. My name is Felix Jang. I'm a product manager here at Armorblox, and today we're excited to have Doug Cahill, Senior Analyst and Group Director, covering cybersecurity, along with Amit Naik, Director of Product Marketing for Armorblox. In this webinar today, Doug will be discussing his paper on securing the human perimeter with natural language understanding. Now, a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. Your lines will be muted, so if you have any questions, please type them into the question box in your Zoom control panel. I'll bring them up during our session, and we'll also have time to take more questions at the end. Shortly after the webinar, we'll share a recording with you via email that will be available on demand. And with that, I'm pleased to turn it over to Doug Cahill. Doug, over to you.
Great, Felix, thanks very much. And thanks everybody for joining today's webinar on what I feel are two really important topics. And we're really going to connect the dots between those two topics. So the notion of the human perimeter and leveraging natural language understanding as a form of artificial intelligence to secure the human perimeter. Just before we get into the webinar, I think it's fair to say that we really need to rethink fundamentally what constitutes today's perimeter. And quite honestly, I think sometimes, especially those who do what I do for a living, being an analyst, will overstate the demise of the physical perimeter. Most organizations operate in a hybrid multi-cloud. They still have a DMC. They still have a physical perimeter. But with the broad adoption of cloud services and knowledge worker mobility, we have additional perimeters. We have a data perimeter, certainly. We have an identity perimeter or human perimeter. And that's really some of the themes for today's webinar is how NLU can be brought to bear to really secure one of the really sort of fluid and amorphous elements of today's perimeter. And so to do that, the ground we're going to cover in today's webinar is first just take a bit of a step back. We're going to widen the aperture, and we're going to talk about some recent ESG research that will convey the cybersecurity imperative. We conduct an annual technology spending intention study. We've been doing that for about 13 years. I'm going to share with you some peer-level research data from your peers and other organizations, IT and cyber leaders, with respect to cloud adoption, some of the challenges that creates from a cybersecurity perspective. And then if the notion of a human perimeter is a bit of an ambiguous concept for you, we're going to attempt to define that for you. So Amit and I are going to have a conversation about really how we should think about the human perimeter. We're going to take a fresh look at what's been happening with phishing compromises, especially specific to the rise in business email compromises, which unfortunately I'm sure many of you on the line today have experienced, and look at some of the other trends in phishing in general. And then finally, we're going to get into how we're going to solve for some of the challenges that we would have laid out so far, some of the investments that organizations are making in artificial intelligence, and specifically then get into the 5 dimensions of natural language understanding as an appropriate and really purposeful implementation of AI for some of the email phishing issues that we're going to talk about, but also for DLP. Really, the notion of sort of any text that an end user interacts with is appropriate. This is appropriate use cases to apply NLU. Okay, so with that overview of the ground that we're going to cover, let's jump right in and first start by widening the aperture a little bit. So as I mentioned, we do this annual study. We've been doing it for over a dozen years. This prior year, we had 800 respondents. We had a really nice mix of IT decision makers, but also a line of business owners. And the reason we included some of the line of business owners is because, IT increasingly is becoming decentralized, right? We know about shadow IT, business units that are standing up their own app dev team and, really leveraging the agility of the cloud to expedite time to market. And so one of the questions we've been asking for a couple of years now is, hey, do you have a cloud-first orientation? When you think about new IT initiatives, do you sort of default to cloud, either, as a software as a service or infrastructure/platform as a service? So we've seen a notable increase year over year from the 29% in 2017 that said, yep, we've got a cloud-first orientation sort of by default to 39% here going into 2019. So we think this is significant because this is really, at the root what is causing a shift in the perimeter. And it's not just cloud first, it's also knowledge worker mobility. We know that increasingly employees are working remote. We have branch offices. We've got employees really sort of this notion of anytime access, any device, anytime. And one of the things that, is really driving cloud first are really sort of mainstream applications like Office 365 and Gmail, where we're seeing on-prem Exchange servers getting, phased out in favor of Office 365. So that's just one example of, sort of how cloud first gets manifested. Now, given that initiative around cloud first and the increase in the number of businesses that have adopted that as their posture, that sort of directly leads to an increase in spending associated with public cloud infrastructure and public cloud applications. But also at the top of that list are two of the areas that we'll be talking about today, artificial intelligence / machine learning, as well as cybersecurity. So it's no mistake to me when I look at a question that says, hey, what are your areas of IT spend that will increase the most in 2019 relative to 2018, that these four hit the top of the list. Because there's a close relationship between these four areas. And for me, what that relationship is this notion of a readiness gap. The degree to which organizations have already adopted cloud services is well ahead of their ability to secure those services. And so that's why these are very synergistic that, increasing spend for infrastructure as a service, increasing spend in cloud applications like Office 365. At the same time, I've got to make sure I'm securing that use vis-a-vis cybersecurity. And there's a lot of awareness in the industry now that a highly effective and efficient way to do so is by leveraging AI/ML. So at the same time, this is sort of the dichotomy that we have here, that there is good news that we're increasing spend in cybersecurity, no question. It's funded, but very often it's not resourced. And the reason it's not resourced is because there continues to be an acute shortage of cybersecurity skills. So as you can see in this question, we asked our respondents, in which of the following areas do you believe that your IT organization has a problematic shortage of existing skills? We've been asking this question in that same study for a number of years now. And it's been 41%, then 43%, then 46%, then 51%. So it's just not getting any better. It is absolutely a chronic issue. And what that means is, in addition to things like training programs and embracing diversity on your cybersecurity team, we need cybersecurity controls that not only move the needle on the efficacy of detecting and preventing more threats, but also the operational efficiency in doing so. We know that so many organizations have alert fatigue, point tool fatigue. We just simply have to do better. So one of the questions we asked in the study is, do you think IT's become more complicated over the last couple of years? 2/3 of respondents, by the way, said, yeah, IT's become more complicated. To me, we're moving in the wrong direction, because one of the promises of cloud computing in general was get out of the business of managing your data center, right? It should be like a service. It should be a utility. Yet again, respondents are saying, no, actually things have gotten more complicated. So then actually the next question is, well, what's driving that, right? What do you believe are the biggest reasons on why your IT environment has become more complicated over the last year or so? And there are a couple of things that are at play here. One is volume of devices. We simply have different types of endpoint devices, not only smartphones and tablets, but also IoT devices coming online in high volume. High data volume, right? We still have data explosion. So much of today's business models are data driven. We absolutely are in an application economy, right? So we've got increased the number and type of applications that employees are using to get their job done. And encouragingly, though, we're also seeing that there's a need to incorporate emerging technologies. So it may seem strange that in this mix here of drivers, we've also got artificial intelligence, and that's simply because IT and security professionals need to first understand AI to then determine the appropriate use cases of implementing AI to solve some of the challenges that they have in their environment. And again, that's one of the main themes for today's presentation, really how AI and natural language understandings and implementation AI specifically can be applied to the use cases of securing the human perimeter. So, hey, I'm interested in your thoughts here. As you're talking to your customers, businesses in general, are you hearing the same sorts of things in terms of what's driving complexity in their environment?
Yes, Doug, absolutely. So, I read an interesting statistic recently that says about 60% of cybersecurity incidents that are flagged by all the various systems that organizations have, they're left unprocessed. And I think that's a very concerning symptom of the cybersecurity skills shortage, but also sort of the explosion in volume of devices, data platforms, and all the things that an organization has to secure. So this is absolutely something we see organizations are struggling with. And I think to really effectively solve this, we need an approach that actually engages all users, right? Not just pushes the problem onto some purpose, some specific skill sets and specific individuals, but engages all users across the organization. And there's no other effective way to fight this.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And by the way, that stat about volumes of alerts coming into the SOC and not getting processed. We've seen the same in our research and in talking to SOC analysts is, as you expand attack surface, you get more telemetry coming in. It just becomes basically impossible to deal with arbitrating what's really just an event versus an alert. So what we need is high fidelity. We need more accuracy, so we have less false positives. So SOCs can get their arms around focusing on a smaller number of actionable alerts.
Absolutely, and even SOC, even the organizations that have these specialists in SOCs, right? They struggle with the lack of context because they don't know if a particular incident that got flagged is a legitimate business workflow or a threat, right? So they lack the understanding and they lack the context to make those determinations, and you end up with a whole bunch of inefficient processes, and end up slowing down the employees in the workforce.
Boy, it's so true. I mean, organizations have the swivel chair issue where, hey, I may get an alert in my SIEM, then I've got to drop into a couple other products to really do the root cause analysis. They're IMing with their colleagues to see what they've seen in their tools, and it's just highly inefficient. And I think that leads directly into the findings in this research question, which was, when you think about your objectives for your modern IT environment, your DX environment, what are the top initiatives? Becoming operationally efficient was number one. It's how do I streamline operations? And obviously what we were just talking about is applying this in a security context, given the increased level of complexity of an IT environment and the need to really, get higher fidelity and more accuracy and alert triage. So great. So those, I just wanted to share, sort of kick things off today with some context around what we're seeing from our research and conversations with many of your peers out in the market on some of the macro drivers in terms of cloud adoption, and that's driving complexity and the need for greater fidelity and efficiency moving forward. Let's spend a little time now on this notion of the human perimeter and really sort of try to ground this in a good definition. So, for starters, what I would suggest is we need to think of the human perimeter as being more than your employees. Cloud applications, especially collaboration platforms like, Slack and HipChat, and certainly enterprise file sync and share services like Box, Dropbox, OneDrive, et cetera, have really enabled collaboration with external parties, and that's a good thing, right? It's become the new normal of business workflows. It allows organizations to really leverage third parties to bring new products and services to market, but it also increases third-party risk. And later we're going to be talking about phishing, and when we work with so many external third parties, it sort of creates this condition with our employee base that they're used to receiving emails from a wide variety of third parties, and that simply just makes it harder to arbitrate what's a legitimate email versus what is actually a fraudulent, bogus email. So as you can see in the research data here, specifically what we're asking is, types of users that have access to an organization's sensitive cloud data, cloud resident data. Obviously, full-time employees at 75%, but boy, there are a lot of other types of humans, if you will, just in the context of defining human perimeter, that are accessing cloud resident data, from partners to contractors to even your customers and suppliers.
So this is
so there's a lot of personas.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting data, right? And I think what a lot of the underlying driver behind all of this is this migration of business workflows to online channels, right? People are doing more and more business over. I mean, we understand, of course, there's e-commerce and sort of the more more structured channels, but there's a lot of business happening over email, right? Invoices are getting approved and shared between partners and vendors, and there's very little integrity in those workflows inherently. But that seems to be the dominant way for some organizations to do business. And there's nothing wrong. It's not wrong that they're doing that, but the challenge is it's also an attack surface that scammers can exploit.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think online channels, boy, it's a great way to frame it up. And even there are some organizations that are using things like PandaDocs and DocuSign, sort of cloud-based services to issue SOWs and get sign off on legal documents. Totally meet. I mean, so much business is still being conducted via email. It's still the primary channel. The other dimension of the human perimeter are the devices that individuals are using. And the context of the move to bring your own device in so many organizations, and just personal devices being introduced, and sort of the blurring of the lines between sort of personal workspace and business workspace, we're seeing that sensitive cloud resident data is being accessed from insecure devices. In fact, only per this research, only a touch over a quarter of the respondents are saying that they apply significant limitations on the device types that are allowed to access their organization's public cloud resident sensitive data. Only 26%. So, defense in depth is always the right answer. But in the cases where devices aren't secure, we've got to make sure we secure the human element. So what I'm saying is, ideally, all of our devices would be secure. We would be doing device profiling. We would have effective endpoint security controls. Basically, we'd be implementing sort of a zero trust model to limit what devices are allowed to access the network, cloud applications, limit the privileges that they're allowed to access that data with. But absent the ability to do so, because of, again, we've got, non-employees that are accessing the data, we've got those individuals as well as employees using a variety of insecure devices, it really sort of shifts the focus back to, hey, we've got to really be focused on the individual and the human and their behavior and the text that they're interacting with. So one of the other questions we asked in this particular study is, sort of the self-awareness and how confident the respondents were that their cloud resident sensitive data is effectively secured. So I can sort of look at this data two ways. The glass half full perspective says that, wow, 75% of the respondents are saying that, at least 21% of their data is their cloud resident sensitive data, I should say, is not being effectively secured. The glass half full perspective says at least they're aware of that fact, right? And this, to me, this is all part and parcel of closing the cloud security readiness gap. So, the IT and the cyber team simply can't slow down the adoption of the cloud services for the dynamics and factors that we've talked about already. So as more corporate data, corporate sensitive data, goes northbound to the cloud, this is the reality that we're left with right now, is that there is in fact a readiness gap. And so one of the logical next question is what has this led to? And, to me, this is a pretty sobering statistic. 50% of the respondents in our study shared with us that their organization has in fact experienced a loss of cloud resident data, and another nearly quarter, 22% of the respondents suspect that they have. That's sort of interesting statistic. They think they have, but they're not really sure because they don't really have an audit trail. They, as things go outside of the network controls, there's this visibility gap. They can't necessarily know definitively whether or not they've lost cloud resident sensitive data, but they suspect that they have.
Yeah, this is an interesting statistic, and especially in the light of data privacy regulations that are popping up all over the world, right? And it's concerning that almost 50% of the respondents they know that they've lost data that's resident in the cloud. And as we see, GDPR was the first sort of major one that caused a lot of organizations to take pause, but we're seeing similar regulations pop up all over the world. California has a CCPA, which goes into effect on January 1st, 2020, and we'll see other states follow suit as well soon. So this is an interesting statistic.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And I think about making sure you're meeting and maintaining compliance with those data privacy regs. It really starts with discovering and classifying the data types that are subject to those regs. And as we'll talk about in just a little bit, that's also a challenge for organizations and a priority moving forward. So one of the other questions we asked the participants in this particular study is, okay, so you've experienced loss of cloud resident data. What were the top causes? What happened here? So there are a lot of causes. So, unfortunately, there are a lot of issues to tie off on here, but when I look at all these and I think, okay, thematically what's going on here, it's because of a failure to secure the human perimeter. We had employees that were uploading sensitive data to cloud service. We had data exposed from personal devices, like we talked about on a prior slide. We had a mismatch of permission levels, right? And then we had the issue of stolen credentials. So sort of two flavors of insider threat here. The insider threat that is the unwitting insider, that their creds got stolen. We'll be talking about credential theft in just a little while, or the actual malicious insider that has nefarious intent, as well as just users sharing data externally vis-a-vis a cloud service, maybe with a partner, maybe with a friend, maybe, perhaps with a family member. So the various concept issues here at play, but again, thematically weaving throughout all these, there's a human element. So, Amit, when you talk to customers that engage with Armorblox, potentially, unfortunately, maybe after a data breach, are they sharing these sort of root causes for maybe why they've had a breach?
Absolutely, right. So this agrees with what we're hearing from our customers and prospects, and one of the big challenges that is top of mind for many CISOs is accidental data disclosure, right? So people inadvertently sending content to the wrong person. And in the cloud sharing system, it's very easy to go in and mistype a name or type an additional name that you didn't intend to, and expose that data to people that are outside the trusted zone, right? Same thing with email, right? So we've all kind of seen this happen in the past, where your autocomplete fills in an email address for you, and then it may be a really busy day for you. You go hit enter, and then the data has gone out to people that it was not intended to. So that's another big emerging issue that organizations are grappling with. And the challenge with that is even though it was accidental, it doesn't excuse you from any of the compliance regimes, right? So if you're a healthcare organization, you're still subject to HIPAA. If you're handling data for European citizens, you're still subject to GDPR, and so on.
Yeah, those are great examples. And as you were mentioning that, I'm thinking to myself, yeah, I've done that, right? I mean, you autofill an email and you're sending it to John, and you send it to the wrong John, right? I mean, it just happens all the time, and hopefully it wasn't an email with sensitive content, but sometimes it is.
Yeah, and sometimes sometimes there's a lack of understanding of what cloud sharing means, right? So creating a sharing link for a document in Google Drive, for example. What does that expose you to, right? Does that mean anybody with that link can access that piece of content? Most people are not aware of the exposure that this creates.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's sort of the third line that's in yellow here, which is the misuse of permission controls, or just sort of the wrong ACLs on a cloud store. You may have that folder wide open to a group, and really it should be restricted. So. Okay, so We've been sort of talking a little bit here about the email channel. So we did want to spotlight specifically the rise in business email compromises, some of the other trends that we're seeing in phishing. Fortunately, we've absolutely been on a rinse and repeat cycle of phishing, right? Whale phishing, spear phishing, smishing, or SMS phishing. Personally, I've been getting just a ton of those. Even the robocalls, right? I mean, we're all just so fatigued of the robocalls. That's another type of phishing. It's obviously not email phishing, but there are so many creative ways that cyber criminals now are attempting to get our personal information. Of all of those types of phishing, there's been an incredible increase in business email compromises, and it really reminds me, and I'm very interested in your thoughts on this. It's sort of where we were with ransomware a couple of years ago. It's not like BEC is new, over the last 12 to 18 months, nor was ransomware new a couple of years ago, but there just became this sort of epidemic level, and I think it was born out of the success rate that cyber criminals were having with those attack types, that they were highly effective. There was a low barrier to entry for them to perpetrate those attacks. And so they wanted a written repeat cycle, like I said, and they just conducted more of these attacks. So I think there's a corollary here, what we're seeing with BEC, with what we saw with ransomware a couple of years back.
You're absolutely right. BEC is turning into a very, very organized criminal endeavor. We're seeing cases where there's call centers behind these emails, right? So there's a phone number in the email, and if you call it, there's actually somebody that answers and will corroborate the story, right? There's actually physical addresses that these folks rent to try and gain your trust, to try and make the email look legitimate, right? I mean, the FBI estimates, based on, and this is data up to 2018, this is a $12 billion problem. I'm sure it's up to 15 to $18 billion by now, and this is the U.S. alone. And this, and you're absolutely right. This is, they're bolstered by the success rate of these attacks in the organization. There you go.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know our adversaries will take the easy path by default, and unfortunately, this has been all too easy. And just you were just quantifying almost sort of the target addressable market here, for BEC, and this puts BEC and also email account compromises in context with other types of fraud, and it tops the charts. So in 2018 alone, according to the FBI, that there was 1.3 billion in loss, took the top spot. So it's highly successful, and it's no wonder that there's a sort of preponderance for these attacks and the predisposition of the adversaries to repeat these. And I mean, the stat you just said is this is based on a PSA from the FBI right about a year ago. So you're right, this is a little dated, so I'm sure the number is bigger. About a year ago, they said that from the period of October 2013 into spring of last year, that they were estimating, business email compromised losses at 12.5 billion. And they've seen a notable increase. So this is the, sort of my point about how, we've had these before, but there's been a notable increase here over the last, say, 18 months, just as, ransomware was a couple of years ago. So there's been a 427% increase since 2015. Big numbers. I mean, this is, unfortunately, this is simply good business for cyber criminals.
Yeah, and the reason these scams continue to work is they're exploiting sort of the lack of integrity in business workflows, right? Workflows that happen over email, workflows without verification or validation steps in them, and that's really what they're exploiting here, and they're seeing a lot of success with it.
Oh, it's so true, and this is an example of one of those workflows, and I know later in the webinar you've got some examples of seemingly benign emails that in fact are pass other security controls that actually are malicious, and this is an example. This is from your trusted bank, where they're notifying a customer that there was something that was anomalous and suspicious, and hey, all you need to do is click on this link. Obviously, you've got to log into your account to be able to validate or contest that particular transaction, and that's obviously the way that they're stealing credentials. this is a true story. I literally got an email from my bank yesterday about a transaction. It was actually legitimate, so it was not a BEC, but I'm a cybersecurity analyst, so I'm probably not indicative of the rest of the market, but I was just so sort of on edge and about the whole issue and in tune. This is the other type of example. This is a very well crafted, seemingly legitimate email, completely with member of the FDIC 2005 from your trusted bank, right? Looks completely legitimate. So the broader context here, there's essentially two types of these BEC compromises, right? There's one where the adversary will use a trusted sender name. It's from somebody that you know and you trust, very often a CEO, as we showed on the prior slide. But if you look at the email address, it obviously is bogus. We've been getting some of these here at my company from our CEO and founder. And if you look at the email address, it's totally bogus. So you can quickly figure out that, okay, this is a phishing email. But if you can steal the creds, and I can send you an email having stolen your creds, that gets awfully hard to detect, because even the more, sort of astute employee is going to say, all right, well, this is from Joe, the CEO, or, Mary, the CEO, and that is his or her email address. So, hey, it looks legitimate, and I'm going to go ahead and do the wire transfer. So it makes it harder. And sort of along those lines, adversaries are absolutely exploiting the broad adoption of Office 365. So we've seen this in spades, which, seemingly legitimate email. And, very often this is just, you got to update your password, right? Hey, it's that time of the quarter. We change your passwords here at Acme Incorporated, once a quarter. So please click on this link. And obviously we need your existing password to change your password. And that's just simply another way to steal credentials. I mean, what are you seeing out there? Is Office 365 sort of the low-hanging fruit here for cyber criminals to steal creds?
Absolutely. So we've seen this gradual migration of organizational email to Office 365 over the last few years, and it's only increasing, right? Microsoft's made it very lucrative and attractive for organizations to not maintain on-premise Exchange servers, and we're seeing migration to the cloud. And the challenge here is the credentials here may be shared across multiple services, right? So somebody might send you a link that's a OneDrive link, and you have to log in to get to a document, but it may be a credential phishing attack, and that now this gives the attacker access to your Office 365 credentials across OneDrive, across Teams, across email. And using that identity, they can now get in and create do a lot of mischief. So this is absolutely what we're seeing out there, along with spoofing techniques that we're aware of, where you may have a different email address but the same name. And most people, unless you're aware and you're tuned in, you're not going to go verify that, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great Uber point, which is that there are many use cases for stolen credentials. I was being a little myopic and just focusing on the BEC use case, but especially if you're phishing, say, your Salesforce admin, and so now you have those credentials. And then you're off to the races, getting access to all your customer data. Similar to your point, if you can get your O365, it's not just the email account, right? It's OneDrive, et cetera. So many a use case. So while we've been talking about credential theft and business email compromise, ransomware, unfortunately, continues unabated. There have been some prominent ransomware attacks as of late hitting municipalities, right? We all know of one in New Jersey and one in Florida. This is big business for cyber criminals. Again, there's an estimation here that by 2021, this is going to be a $20 billion business. And, unfortunately, healthcare has just been hit super hard with the ransomware. According to the Verizon data breach report from 2019, they estimate that 70% of ransomware attacks are against healthcare organizations. And that's going to continue to increase here over the next few years. I guess I should never really think that cyber criminals are going to have any, sort of empathy for their targets, but it never ceases to amaze me that they don't think about crippling the ability for a healthcare organization to provide service to patients. I just maybe I shouldn't be so naive, but that dimension of these attacks just does continue to amaze me.
Yeah, that's really unfortunate, right? Because this is taking money away from critical services for citizens, for patients, and from hospitals, right? And it's really unfortunate. But we're just kind of curious, what are you seeing? There's a lot of security awareness training out there. How effective are you seeing this at being at controlling some of these issues like ransomware and ransomware attacks that have plagued a lot of organizations?
Yeah.
Clearly, we see that they're successful, but just kind of curious to see what you're seeing out there.
Sure. It's a great question. I mean, I think they're effective to a point. I use the phrase rinse and repeat. I think that's one of the ways I would characterize an effective end user awareness training program is you need to keep on conducting those, ideally in the context of some red teaming, so you can baseline whether or not your employee base is falling suspect to certain types of phishing attacks. And it really needs to be focused on those users that seem to be those that fall prey regularly to phishing attacks. One of the things that's interesting from the latest VDBR report, actually might have been the 2018 report, it was 2018 or 2019, but it basically said that the same users are the ones that keep on falling for these attacks. So it's effective to a point, but we know a cyber program is all about defense in depth, so it's one of the layers, but in and of itself is not going to be the silver bullet solution. You absolutely have to bring other approaches and controls to bear. The other, I guess, interesting thing about ransomware, not to give it any credit, but and this screenshot just kills me, to be honest with you, is that how ransomware has become operationalized. I mean, from this screenshot, you can contact the attacker. You can check your payment status. Hey, you can even get a tutorial on Bitcoin, right? So, and they're also creating a sense of urgency with a countdown clock. So this just shows that this is, this is a broad-based business for cyber criminals, and they've operationalized it. We've even seen, chat windows in these attacks where you can go back and forth with the attacker. So, ransomware attacks, just so indicative of how broad-based these are, they've absolutely become operationalized. Okay, Meet, I'm feeling like we've talked enough about problems and time to get into some solutions. So enough of the gloom and doom. There is, in fact, help on the way. And one of the things we found from some recent research is that there's some initiatives that are top priorities for organizations that just make a ton of sense to me, right? The first one is, hey, when I think about securing my data assets and my organization in general, I really need to improve how I discover and classify sensitive data and meet, to your point, very often to meet regulatory compliance. So, the old adage, you can't secure what you can't see, you can't be compliant. If you can't see it, this is all about visibility. As the data goes outside of the corporate perimeter, it becomes even more important. And part and parcel with that, equal with number one, so about 35% is actively monitoring user access to our most sensitive data. Not all data is created of equal value in terms of its intrinsic value to the business. And so we need to discover and classify our sensitive data. Then we've got to monitor end user access to that sensitive data. And again, thinking about third-party risk, we've also got to be monitoring third parties that have access to that data. So, in the research, I'm always looking for silver linings and how we're moving the needle and improving security posture. This is one of those research slides for me, where I think these are appropriate top priority initiatives that organizations are taking to better secure their environment. Now, those are really about sort of, mostly process oriented, right? This is about technology. And so again, this comes from our annual technology spending intention study. And we asked the respondents a couple of questions related to artificial intelligence and machine learning. One was just sort of more broadly, in the context of their data center in terms of top initiatives in 2019. And you can see the number 2 initiative is, I want to leverage AI and ML as an embedded feature within our IT products and solutions. So this isn't, AI and ML as a separate product or product category. It's got to be baked in and incorporated. And in a cybersecurity context, it is one of the 2 areas of incremental spend in 2019. So we're not showing the question we ask on this particular side, but the question we're asking on the right-hand side of the slide is, in your cybersecurity budget, in which area will you make the most notable increase in spend in 2019? And number 2, as you can see, are security tools that leverage AI and ML for threat detection and prevention. Amik, I've got a theory on why that is. And it's beyond the obvious, which is about efficacy, where using advanced algorithms, we can detect and prevent more threats. I think it's also about efficiency. What are your thoughts there?
So absolutely. So like we mentioned earlier, this sobering statistic about the number of events that go unprocessed, right? So one side of it is how do we kind of more effectively address and deal with those incidents and automate a lot of those workflows, right? So that's one aspect of it. But the other side of it, like you mentioned, is also improving the efficacy. So we have fewer incidents, and when they are flagged, there are fewer false positives, and they're more meaningful and they're more valid, right? So it kind of AI ML helps with both sides of the equation.
Yeah, it's a great point about you're responding to less. So the notion of efficacy and efficiency definitely go hand in hand, right? If you can increase efficacy and you can simply stop more, then you're responding to less. That makes a ton of sense. Okay, so what we're going to get into next is natural language understanding as an implementation of artificial intelligence. And as we can see in the text here, well, the way we're defining NLU is to really think about this as an application of AI that is focused fundamentally on the text with which humans interact. Now, it's more than just the words, though, right? It's really about the context around those words. So things like the email address, the syntax of an email, how the email is formatted, the actual content, the style of the message body, if that's consistent with other messages that sender may have sent previously, the types of files that are sent and stored by users. There's also other dimensions that are really important to consider that provide additional context. Amit, you want to cover some of those dimensions in terms of like the who and the whom and so forth?
Absolutely. So I mean, at a very simple level, NLU is technology that you've already used. So if you ever use Alexa or Siri on your phone or the Google Assistant, you've already used NLU, right? So it's not new. It's been around for a little while. And what NLU helps you do is derive understanding and meaning from textual content. Now, that textual content may be communication, right? It may be emails going back and forth. It may be data at rest in the cloud storage service. It helps you kind of really understand what is in that piece of content and what it means to the organization. So if you skip ahead one slide. So when you think about the human perimeter, right, and adequately defending it, there are 5 sort of dimensions we look at from an NLU perspective. So the first one is access, and the first 2 are access and behavior. So access is who is sending the message, or who owns the content that's been uploaded. Behavior is kind of how they're sending it, right? Are they sending it over an email channel? Are they sending it as a direct cloud sharing? Are they sending it over Slack, over Teams, etc.? And most access and behavior are sort of areas that have been analyzed extensively before using sort of more of the traditional ML techniques like statistical clustering, and so on. And you can find these, right? So this is, for example, how Google uses Google keeps your inbox from filling up with spam, right? And they've been doing this for a very long time, understanding who are the spammers and who are the senders that are sort of bad. But what NLU does is also adds in the 3 additional dimensions, which is content, context, and network. So content is, well, what is actually this piece of content and this piece of communication of this document? Context is, what is the intent behind this, right? Actually understanding what this document is trying to do. What is the essence of it, or what a piece of email is trying to achieve. And then network is understanding the communication patterns and understanding the social graph of who this user is talking to and with whom this user is exchanging this content. And when you put all of this together and when you combine this with the traditional metadata signals that have been used in cybersecurity for a very long time, and you add in this human layer context, what you get is you get much better detection efficacy. We talked about this before. And it dramatically reduces the number of false positives and thus reducing the burden on the SOC team. So now the incidents are more relevant and there's fewer of them, right? And that leaves your organization in a better position from a threat perspective. Next slide, please.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this really grounds what NLU is in providing context around the text with which individuals are interacting. Especially the intent, right? Sort of really understanding the body of an email, for example, and really the intent of that email. And if it really is for a financial transaction, that ought to be cause for pause right there.
Yeah, and I have two great examples coming up about this. So the first one is around email communication. And if we can skip to the next slide. So here's an example of an email communication. This is actually taken from a real email data set that's out on the internet. And here is what appears to be an internal email between 2 individuals in an organization. And it's basically saying everything should be done for closing on the Leander deal on the 29th. And I've sent the closing statement. And you set up a wire transfer to go out tomorrow. There are some wire details. Seems like a pretty innocuous email that you'd find in an organization, right? And I would find between 2 internal users. And if you look at the traditional detection mechanisms, like does this have a phishing link, right? It does not. Does it pass all the DMARC checks? So the DMARC checks are technical validation checks that the email protocols use to determine that the sender is really authorized to send this. There's no malware in here. There's no it passes all the DLP content because there's no attachments, there's no documents being sent with this. Well, this is a potential compromise email, right? And you can't know that unless a human reads this and applies judgment to figure out that, hey, there's something sounds fishy about this. And on a good day, you may be able to flag this yourself, but most of us have pretty busy days, and these emails usually strike you in the last day of the quarter or the day before a deal's about to close, and that's kind of how they kind of find humans at a time when their judgment may be a little bit rushed, right? But if you look at this from an NLU perspective, on the next slide. So with NLU, we can actually understand the content and the context of this email. So we understand that there is a sensitive topic being discussed, which is the Leander deal, and that's determination that's been made by analyzing a lot of email content, right? There's a request in there, which is, send a wire transfer, right? You can determine that. There's a sense of urgency. So it says, can you set it up to go out tomorrow, right? So I need this done now. There's closing statements, more sensitive content, and then the wire details. And I haven't listed them here, but these are also things that NLU can understand and determine that these are financial details we've not seen before in communication between these 2 individuals, right? So combining all of these vectors together, along with the metadata, along with the identity models and social graphs, we can make a more qualified judgment call that this is a compromise attempt. And then the other area where NLU is extremely helpful is in content classification. So if you've dealt with any DLP platforms in the past, data leakage prevention has been a hard thing to do for most organizations. And one of the reasons, one of the challenges is, well, how do you classify content, right? How do you know that something is potentially, this document is what you intended to prevent or to prevent from going outside the organization? And historically, this has relied on keyword-based detection, regular expression-based detection. So here's an example. We have 3 documents. And the first one is a document of interest, which is an offer of employment. Now, if I just use keyword-based detection and create a policy that is keyed on the words offer of employment, guess what? It's also going to catch the benefits document, which has employment in it, right? It's also going to catch the job posting, which has offer in it. And it's going to catch a whole lot of other stuff, and which is not relevant. And what that ends up doing is it ends up sitting in some SOC incident response database as a false positive, right? And just creates a lot of noise in the SOC workflow. But if you really leverage NLU for understanding what's this document, NLU can understand the difference between an actual offer of employment versus all these other documents, and dramatically reduce the false positives in the DLP system. So content classification is, again, an area where NLU offers a lot of benefits. And if you want to understand and see this, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so we're talking about multiple use cases here for NLU, and we're sort of a little fixated up front around business email compromise. But what you're suggesting here is, hey, in a broader data loss prevention program and the need to identify, discover, classify sensitive data, NLU can be brought to bear there too.
Absolutely. And if you're interested in understanding or seeing a demo of how all of this works, you can go to our website at www.armorblox.com/demo, and we'd be happy to walk you through how NLU helps defend against these risks and show you NLU in action. And of course, Doug is a great white paper from Doug as well on securing the human perimeter with natural language understanding, which is also available on our website at armorblox.com/resources. And it summarizes a lot of the concepts that we talked about today, and it's a great read. With
Fantastic.
that,
Again, thanks everybody. Yeah. I think that's a wrap and meet, and I think we have a little time to take some questions. I don't know if there's any questions from the audience. Felix, any questions come in?
Yeah, thanks again, Doug. Yes, there are a few questions. So the first one here is what is the difference between NLP, natural language processing, and NLU, natural language understanding?
Thanks, Felix. I can take that one. So NLP is more of the science of taking textual data and breaking it down into its constituents and elements, and understanding that something is a topic or something's referring to a verb or an action, and understanding what all the constituents are. NLU is natural language understanding is really the science of taking all of these pieces and understanding the context and what is the context behind it. So as you saw in the email example, right? So we were able to kind of take all those constituents and understand that this is potentially a risky email. That's the difference between NLP and NLU.
Excellent. And yeah, another question here. If my organization already has a SEG, security email gateway solution, that's also experiencing these human perimeter issues, how do we think about a solution like Armorblox?
Yeah, so the human perimeter is not limited to one channel, right? It extends across multiple platforms, multiple communication channels. Email's just one of them. But there's also, we're seeing with the advent of Slack and Teams, we're seeing a lot of organizations communicate over those channels predominantly, right? So when you need to solve this problem, you need to look at it sort of as a platform, as a complete platform that works across all of these channels. And And by looking at multiple dimensions, we can also make the detection a lot more effective by understanding that, hey, there was a communication about this topic internally on a Slack channel, so we know that when that topic appears in email, it's probably legitimate, right, versus not.
Excellent. And one other question about AI ML solutions. There's a lot of companies out there with the AI ML buzzwords in their marketing. How does one really determine if that kind of marketing is just used on the website versus if the solution itself is actually heavily utilizing AI and ML?
Yeah, Felix, that's a great. Yeah, I'm happy to chime in on that. I think it's a point well taken that AI ML has become the shiny new object, and it's sort of front and center in a lot of vendor marketing right now. And that's not to diminish the compelling applicability of the technology, but it is to note that buyers should double click with the vendor on exactly how they think about AI ML, really in the context of use cases. So I think Meet offered a tremendous amount of excellent use cases that conveys how Armorblox thinks about NLUs and implementation of AI. I think in other domains, when we think about AI for malware detection and prevention, you want to be talking to vendors about how their algorithms are trained against what sort of corpus of binaries, and whether or not they're using AML to detect new and unknown bad, or whether or not they're also using that to get higher fidelity on the bad by also detecting what's good. So there's a series of questions there, and there is a little bit of a buyer beware. And I just think you want to be engaging with vendors that cannot be offering specific use cases and how AI and ML is brought to bear along the lines of how Amit shared how the Armorblox solution protects you against BEC, as well as data loss by being able to discover and classify sensitive data.
That's awesome. Thanks a lot, Doug. Yeah, I can certainly agree and empathize with the use cases there. Hey, I think that's all the time that we have for today. So for anyone whose questions have gone unanswered, we will go ahead and take those and email you. Thanks again for joining, and again, Doug and Amit, thanks a lot for the presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.